Hi, welcome to DNA Descendant Research. This is an instructional workshop on how to make use of your DNA results to identify new cousins and hopefully expand your DNA research and your genealogical research. So today we're going to cover a few things that we covered in the previous instructional workshop where we talked about how to cluster your matches. We're going to go a little bit deeper with DNA match relationships and descendant research, of course, cluster research, and sleuthing. So just to go into a little bit more detail, what I mean by DNA relationships is looking at how you're connecting to some of the matches that whatever testing service you've used identifies, and looking at the amount of DNA that's shared and what to make of some of those estimations and other information that you're presented with. DNA descendant research. So that's just going to be identifying descendants of any ancestors, be it in your trees or others' trees. Cluster research is looking at those same individuals, maybe descendants of your third great grandparents, for example, looking at who was in their community and the records that you're using to research. And then also sleuthing, which is going to be how we're going to identify some of our living relatives by finding them in places like public records, social media, and even on genealogy-based websites. So if you're watching this video on YouTube or elsewhere and you want to learn more about the topics that we're going to cover or other things and join our community, you can visit kinkofa.com, it's kinkofa.com, and request an invite to join the community. So why should you cluster? Because clustering is the first step in all of this. So why should you do it? Well, you'll find that with clustering, you'll be able to identify more relatives and how they're connecting to which lines they're relating to on your lineages. If you're an adoptee or have unknown parentage, clustering is going to help make sense of some of your ancestral lines. It's going to identify some of your ancestral lines, surnames, and other relatives. Going to allow you to discover new information almost no matter what the case. It's going to connect you to those new cousins who may have information that you need. It'll also help some of those cousins. So they may have information you need, vice versa could be true. You may have information that could benefit their research, and developing that sort of relationship and finding a genie buddy can be even more expansive and beneficial to your research. So I've mentioned it a few times. Descendant research is the process of identifying the children or grandchildren or other descendants of an ancestor. So this is also called descendancy research. So we're looking at maybe an ancestor in your tree, and you want to find other relatives, other cousins who are living. You would look at, okay, who is that ancestor's children, grandchildren, who are the children of that ancestor's siblings, because that can also expand your research in a similar way. And there's different steps in descendant research. While they're numbered here, there really isn't a particular order that you have to go in. But what is recommended is, of course, you have a starting point. So that's typically identifying a particular ancestor. Maybe it's one of interest or on a line of interest, and that's going to be where you start. From there, you're going to use things like the paper trail, maybe other trees and information that you have and know to track closer to present day. So finding their children, we're not looking to go back in time. We're looking to bring it up to present day with descendant research. And eventually the goal there is to find those living relatives through things like genealogical records, but also public records and other sources to expand your story. You're really growing your tree wide, not long with descendant research. So some things to consider when getting into descendant research. One is that in reaching out to new cousins and other relatives, there are some that may not know the info you're looking for. They may not want to know it. They may not want you to know it. And so that's something to be mindful of, that you're not always going to get what you're looking for immediately. You should tread cautiously when viewing or receiving any information from others, especially from trees like those that you might find on a genealogical website or elsewhere. They often have questionable information, and you should question it whenever you see it. You should be very cautious of what information you're provided. Also, you may discover new information or findings that are sensitive to you or that are sensitive to others, and that you should also be mindful of when entering into this research and also when sharing findings with others. And so what we have here is a juxtaposition of two interesting things. One is a quote by Alice Walker, which reads, "We remember them because it is an easy thing to forget, that we are not the first to suffer, rebel, fight, love, and die. The grace with which we embrace life, in spite of the pain, the sorrow, is always a measure of what has gone before." And so what we see to the left is what has gone before. This is actually an ad from Last Seen, which is an online repository of ads that were placed in newspapers both prior to and after emancipation of formerly enslaved people seeking their family members, seeking their children, their parents, their siblings, and others who were separated and severed through the institution of slavery. And this one is actually one where there was a reunion that took place, and there were many reunions, but there also were not many. And so what we do in this work of descendant research is often bridging some of those severed gaps that have been created because of slavery, because of migrations and other things that have happened in the past. And while that can be a painful experience to kind of resew or sew into, it's one that we don't take lightly, but we can look forward to with an optimism as well, because there's an opportunity for new connections. So hopefully it's an experience for you that is welcomed. And we are going to move ahead to the case study. And so what we'll do is we'll look at a real but not so real example of how you can use descendant research, and feel free to follow along. It's going to rely on AncestryDNA and their interface for DNA matches and trees, and you can feel free to pull up your own so that you can follow along and apply it to your research. I'm just going to move myself out the way. And in this example, we're following the same siblings from the previous workshop, Tina and Brian Hall, who have DNA tested. They have now clustered as a result of the previous workshop. And after clustering, they've learned quite a bit. One, that their great-great-grandparents were Isaac Hall and Mary Diggs Hall. And now Tina and Brian would like to connect with more relatives, more cousins, and learn about their Hall family ancestors and history. And so what Tina and Brian have done, as I mentioned, is they've clustered their matches. They've been able to look at trees and connect with relatives to get a bit of information, get a head start, which some of us do see and receive after DNA testing. Now they want to take it a bit further, and they want to find more relatives. They have matches there, of course, on their AncestryDNA. They want to understand how they're connecting to them. They want to find more. They want to learn more history, find photos, and all of that good stuff. So they have a research question as a result. Who are the descendants of Isaac and Mary Hall? That's really where descendant research fits in, or the answer that's provided to this research question is descendant research. And so this is a view of Tina Hall's tree on Ancestry. So she has her father, Eddie Hall Jr. This is going to follow her paternal lineage. And then her paternal lineage goes all the way back to Isaac Hall and Mary Diggs. And where they want to concentrate on is starting with the siblings of Thomas William Hall, so the son of Isaac and Mary. And from there, they're going to keep tracing back toward present day. So we'll start with where they are starting, and that is bringing it down to present day. So we have Isaac and Mary here. These are their other children. And after learning of their descent from Isaac and Mary, Tina have located their children in the census records. So I mentioned that this is kind of borrowing from both real and fake Isaac and Mary Hall are real people who lived and are recorded in census records, as are their children here. And we've made a fake connection, more or less, so these records can actually be used to trace their descendants. The paper trail is one approach at descendant research, and that's what we're going to start with, because you see here Isaac Hall was born in 1852. The paper trail is going to be our best option at beginning descendant research for Isaac and Mary, because they were born so far in the past. We were looking for someone more recent. We may not look at things like the census records. We may have to rely on another source. So how did they get here? Well, Tina and Brian, as I mentioned, were able to get this new information because in the last presentation, they didn't have full confirmation of who their parents were. They were able to reach out to Miss Hall 4109, who was their closest DNA match in their Hall cluster. They were able to direct message Miss Hall, and Miss Hall, in fact, already knew how Tina and Brian fit into the larger tree, so she was able to provide them with information, confirm who their biological father is, and it just so turns out that Miss Hall 4109 is their half great-grandaunt. So if you recall, this is the view that we had last time, and if you haven't seen it, you can go back and watch the DNA clustering workshop video, also on our YouTube channel. Miss Hall 4109 is right there. She has a yellow dot here representing the Hall cluster, or that's the group she was clustered into. And we can see there was a close relationship at 314 centimorgan shared with Tina. So really, clusters are the key here. That's the starting point. Again, it's a grouping for your DNA matches based on likely common ancestors. So Tina and Miss Hall, for example, share a common ancestor or more. This is a way to identify surnames, view the trees of your DNA matches in a way that makes sense, because you're able to use that in collaboration with other trees within that cluster to fill out how people are relating to one another within a cluster and determine that common ancestry. And then also something to consider is that one large cluster like the Hall cluster could have a subcluster, which could represent a grandparent or great-grandparent line that's further back on that same Hall side. So there's a few interesting things to discover with that. Here is a view of it's the Shared CM project, and really it's a DNA relationship table. If we're starting here in the middle with yourself, this is going to give ranges and averages for the amount of DNA that you would share with someone for a particular relationship. So for example, with Tina, her half great grand aunt is Miss Hall 4109. So we would look, let's see, right up in here, and that relationship would fall within that range to not really to confirm it, but just to, if you're not aware of what the actual relationships are, or if you're narrowing down possible relationships, this table could be a good reference for evaluating, well, what relationships are possible, or understanding if the testing service that you tested with has given you an estimation of a relationship or relationships that are possible. This could be a way to possibly narrow down some of those relationships or rule out some. So now what we'll do is examine how the other matches in that Hall cluster are related to Tina and Brian. So that same cluster that Miss Hall 4109 is in. Where we'll start is looking at the shared match page for Miss Hall 4109 and Tina. So in your own matches for a particular cluster that you're working on, and I'd recommend, if you're just starting with clustering, to either start with a cluster that is more familiar to you, so one that you might know more about, or one that has a larger number of people in it, so people that are closer in relation to you most likely. because that's going to be easier to work with, and you'll be able to apply the same things we do here to those subsequent smaller clusters afterward. So we'll go to the page again for the match of interest or the cluster of interest. In this case, it's Ms. Hall 4109. We'll click shared matches, and it's going to take us to a page something like this, where if you've clustered, you'll see a series of dots that you've probably created for those groups and people who fall within them. In this case, as we viewed in the clustering workshop, we have the bias relatives in Hall Pass 81. Where we're going to start with this sort of descendant research is really focusing on, again, the strongest leads that we have here. So looking at this table, we see that there are trees for these matches. However, 2 of them are private. So in the case of Felicia and Ed Bias, we would probably have to reach out to them, send them a message in order to find out more, or maybe make use of some external sites to find more information about who Felicia and Ed are and how we can possibly get in touch. We do see that Hall Pass 81 has a tree, but it's unlinked to her DNA kit. And so we'll click on their tree. And if we were to click on that, it would take us to a page like this, where it's now comparing Tina and Hall Pass 81, and their tree would appear right here. And so pretending that there's a tree there, we would be able to click on it and then get to Hall Pass 81's tree. So this is a sample view of what Hall Pass's tree might look like. They only had a few people in it, and so we're able to view Hall Pass 81 here, although it's private because they're a living person. Their father is listed as private because they're possibly living. And then their mother is listed there as Pamela Dillon. So if we click on Pamela, we're able to see a little bit more information that Pamela passed away. And this is a possible lead for us in determining Hall Pass's connection to the Hall cluster, because what we want to understand here is, okay, we know that Tina and Brian descend from Isaac and Mary Hall, and that Hall Pass 81 is possibly in their Hall-related cluster. We want to understand, does Hall Pass 81 also fit in that tree as a descendant of Isaac and Mary? And so given that this tree has somewhat limited information, we want to understand what side of Hall Pass 81's tree does their Hall connection potentially come in. Because their name is Hall Pass, that's a kind of strong lead that, well, their surname is probably Hall. We want to understand what side it's on. So what we'll do is we'll focus on the information we have. Pamela Dillon has a birth and death date here, and we're going to Google search that information. Because while that tree is small, there are some strong leads, and I think the mother is the strongest lead. We can look for perhaps an obituary, birth or death records, public records, to get more information on who Pamela is, possibly who her parents are, and other relatives. And also the father for Hall Pass, as I mentioned, might still be living, but that's someone we would possibly want to reach out to, especially if they're a Hall. They may have photos, they may have more history and other information of interest to Tina and Brian. So in a Google search, we were able to discover that there is a obituary on a site like Legacy, which hosts obituaries. I'm just going to move myself. So it reads, Pamela Hall, 63 of Gallic, dies Saturday, March 20th, 2021 in her home, and was born to James and Anita Lawson Dillon. So from that, we're getting the surnames of Pamela's parents. We don't see Hall there. Survivors include her husband, Isaac Hall IV, and daughters, Crystal Hall Martinez and Rhonda Hall. And so we see here that the Hall connection for Hall Pass is likely coming in on that Isaac Hall IV side. It's a familiar name. It could be likely a direct descendant of Isaac and Mary Hall. And we now want to try to focus on that side to see if we can quickly get to a connection on the paternal side for Hall Pass. Also, it's likely that one of the daughters listed here, Crystal or Rhonda, is likely Hall Pass 81. So that's something else to confirm. So the main kind of confirmational evidence there in that previous slide is that Pamela's birth date and death date line up to the information that was in Hall Pass 81's tree for the person listed as their mother. There are surnames that are of interest, and we want to look for more information around that family to try to confirm it, link it up to what we know, and fit them into the Isaac and Mary Hall tree. So what we're going to do is take the names from that obituary and try to find them in other records. So what we did here is a search on Facebook for a Rhonda Hall. And we were actually given a location of Jacksonville, Florida for where Rhonda lived at the time of the obituary. And we're going to try to locate them. For privacy's sake, those photos were blanked out. This is an actual search, but what we would be looking for is possibly the photo of the person who is Hall Pass 81 on Ancestry, or any other contextual information that we can corroborate with what we've just found. So here, we actually weren't able to find any strong immediate leads. So instead of digging deeper with this list of Rhonda Halls, we're going to search for Crystal Hall Martinez. And in that search, in browsing and perusing the profiles, we were able to find a Crystal Hall Martinez, which is a pretty specific combination of names, and that's always good to kind of focus on the less common names, less common places, people that you have specific info for, like birth and death date, marriage dates, spouse and children's names. And so here we have a Crystal Hall Martinez on Facebook, and we're going to look for a few key details. One is posts about family members, particularly ones that you've already identified, like Rhonda Hall or Isaac Hall IV, or their mother, Pamela, or older relatives that you can search for records for, like people that might have been in the 1940 census, or that may have a birth certificate that's online, or photos and posts about family connections. So I mentioned photos on Ancestry and other sites. You'll see a profile photo. That's something you can also use as kind of confirmational evidence to say, hey, this looks like the same person in this photo, and look for other details to confirm there for connections. So in perusing Crystal's page, we were looking for those details, something about family members, family connections, and other details. And what do we see? A post from 2015 from Crystal Hall Martinez says, happy birthday to my hashtag Facebook list little big sis Rhonda. Hope you enjoy your special day. And the photo list attached there is the same photo that Hall Pass 81 uses on Ancestry. So that is some of the evidence that we're looking for to corroborate different records and information that we found, like that obituary. The obituary lists Crystal Hall Martinez, who has a sister, Rhonda, and our hypothesis with all of this is that Crystal or Rhonda, one of them was Hall Pass 81, and this is a likely evidence of that, or an opportunity to reach out and confirm it. So the goal in any of this, again, is to see how Hall Pass 81 and others within that call cluster fit within the tree. So as you're looking at your cluster, you'll want to understand how people within that cluster relate to one another and how they fit within the larger lineage that you're focusing on. So in this case, again, Isaac and Mary Hall. For Rhonda and Crystal, it looks like we've identified a possibility of them being the sisters from the obituary, and one of them being Hall Pass 81. So now, again, it's a good time to possibly reach out on Ancestry in the case of Tina, or even reaching out on Facebook and adding them there, depending on how comfortable you are with that or how you think it might be received. An additional step that we can take is more sleuthing, so looking at their relatives, other photos and information that's included, and seeing how everything kind of fits together. And maybe you'll be able to, for example, find Isaac before their father in that obituary, and maybe there's more info there, more posts, more parents and relatives that fill out the story. So now it's a good time to see what other info you would look for. Going back to the Hall cluster, we have other closer relatives actually to focus on and see how they fit within the Isaac and Mary descendancy. So we see that Benji has a public tree that is linked to his kit that we can look at for more details. There's only a few people in it, but it might be a good enough lead to fit those 3 bias matches that we see there into the Hall tree. So clicking on a tree, this is what we could potentially view, although Benji Bias's name would be private. We wouldn't be able to see because Benji is living. But in their tree, we do see a direct tie actually up to the Hall and Mary Diggs line. So Benji has been able to already connect us to information that's familiar. And we see that same daughter, Lily Hall, a sibling to Thomas William Hall, the great grandparent of Tina and Brian. We're able to see how they connect to Lily as siblings. And what we can now do is focus on the other bias relatives who are in that cluster, because they likely are also descendants of Lily and James. Possible that they're not. It could be 2 siblings married 2 siblings or something else, but what we would want to do is focus on descendant research from this point. Who are the descendants of James and Lily through records like the census, given the time period, possible other vital records, newspapers, obituaries, and be able to pull things closer to present day. And again, that's just focusing at this point on Felicia and Ed, who have private trees, which likely also connect to Isaac and Mary. And we may want to reach out to them. We may want to follow the same process that we just took with Hall Path 81, or also reaching out to Benji and seeing, hey, there are these other matches who have the same surname within my Hall cluster. How do you relate to them? I see that you're a descendant of Isaac and Mary. Are they also? And just one, forming a conversation, but also a potential connection in terms of your research. And for Tina and Brian, their quest to learn more about their Hall family through additional stories, history, and photos. So again, just to kind of sum that up, the paper trail would be where we would start for this bias group, focusing on their Lily Hall descendant line. We could look at their social media profiles because their names are there. We can also use something like public record sites to find more information about their families, who they may live with, and other associations. Public record sites include My Life, Been Verified, Nuber, True People Search, and others. And they are kind of compilation sites that take your public records from voting and other sources and compile them into what actually becomes a genealogical record. So from here, if you haven't already, you can cluster your matches to get to the point of where Tina and Brian are in terms of grouping and isolating their ancestral lines as they're represented in their DNA matches. To do that, you can go back and view our DNA clustering workshop, and that'll help you understand how, or at least getting to the point of understanding how your matches are related to one another by building their trees, just as we've sort of done here without too much detail. You can also add matches to your tree as floating branches. So say, for example, the matches we just looked at didn't have connections to Isaac and Mary, like Hall Path 81. If we took their tree, which only had 2 parents, which we found more from an obituary, you can insert those people into your own tree and focus, in Tina's case, on that Isaac Hall, the fourth line, and try to trace him back to Isaac and Mary. You can also use other sources like a newspaper ad. Maybe you want to place an ad in a paper. This is another way of going about it. If your family's from a small area or you think that there's still relatives living in a particular place, you can place an ad in a paper and say, hey, are you a descendant of Isaac and Mary Hall? If so, please reach out to whatever information you want to provide. Another way is to recruit some sidekicks to your efforts. So that could be DNA matches that you've talked to family historians or others within your family. You can create a Facebook group or plan a reunion as a way to kind of draw interest, bring family together, and recruit more to your calls. We actually have a Facebook group guide, so how to form and manage a Facebook family group in our kinkofa community, which has some resources and templates to get you started and recruit people to your calls. So some resources to recap are, one, the leads method. That's what we primarily use to cluster our matches. And again, more info can be found in the clustering workshop. And then also public record sites. So Nuber.com, been verified, and others can be used to locate more information about living relatives or those who are recently deceased. It sometimes will list household members, birth dates, addresses, and other info, which can be important in reaching out to these potential connections and just determining how you're possibly related. Facebook and Google, of course, are also going to be big in identifying living folks and reaching out as well. So again, if you'd like to learn more, receive more content like this, and join our researching community, you can join kinkofa.com by visiting our site, and then you can join our community from there. And that is it. Thank you for joining.